She smells like urine." My daughter-in-law's whisper cut through the noise of my grandson's birthday party, and the whole world just stopped. The flashing lights of the arcade games blurred into a silent, ugly smear. Her words hung in the air, more real than the cake, more real than my grandson's laughter. What she didn't know was that her poison was about to unlock a secret my late husband left behind, a secret that smelled far worse than her lie. Stay with me until the end to hear how it all unraveled. Subscribe, leave a like, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from, whether it's from your phone, your work, or the comfort of your couch at home. My name is Evelyn Peterson, and I am 78 years old. For most of my life, I've been a quiet fixture here in New Glarus, Wisconsin, like the old Swiss chalet-style house I've lived in for 50 years. People know me for my Danish kringles and my hand-dipped cherry brandy chocolates, small comforts I create in the same kitchen my Arthur and I designed together. He's been gone almost 20 years now, but the scent of cinnamon and almond that permanently clings to these walls feels like his presence, a testament to a life built with precision, care, and a quiet, unshakable dignity. The house is my sanctuary, a museum of a life well lived. The dark wood furniture gleams with polish, and the crocheted doilies I made during long winter nights still protect every surface. The loudest sound is usually the cuckoo clock on the living room wall, a silly gift from Arthur on our 10th anniversary. But that morning the silence felt different. It felt heavier, punctuated by a faint, unfamiliar smell wafting from the hallway near Arthur's old study. It was a strange, cloying scent that I couldn't quite place, and it settled in my chest like a premonition. I tried to shake the feeling, focusing on my routine. Routine is an old woman's best friend. It keeps the ghosts of loneliness at bay. I went out to my garden, the morning air cool and crisp against my cheeks. The peonies were in full bloom, their heavy pink heads nodding in the gentle Wisconsin breeze. Tending to them, feeling the damp earth under my fingernails, has always been my therapy. It's a simple, honest transaction. You give care, and you receive beauty. It's a language I understand, unlike the strained, coded conversations that now defined my family life. That day was my grandson Leo's 10th birthday, and the thought of the party was a knot in my stomach. I knew my son Rick would be there, but it would be Brenda, his wife, who would orchestrate everything. Our relationship had become so mediated. On the rare occasions Rick called, I could hear Brenda in the background, feeding him lines, reminding him what to say. In her eyes, I wasn't a person. I was an obligation, a relic from a past she was eager to bulldoze and replace with something sleeker and more modern. That morning, I didn't know that 4 cruel words from her were about to shatter the quiet dignity I had spent a lifetime building. My mornings are usually my own, a peaceful stretch of time for baking and gardening. But lately, even that peace felt fragile. I found myself replaying conversations, dissecting tones, searching for the affection that used to be so easy with my son. Now, it was filtered through Brenda's impatience. Just last week, I had called to ask about Leo's school project, and Brenda had taken the phone. "Evelyn, we're really busy," she'd said, her voice tight with a familiar annoyance. "Rick will call you back when he has a minute." He never did. Each interaction was a small paper cut, slowly bleeding me of my confidence. The phone rang, its shrill sound an intrusion on the kitchen's warm silence. I wiped the flour from my hands and answered, my heart giving a little flutter of hope that it might be Rick. It wasn't. It was Brenda. Her voice was syrupy sweet, a tone she reserved for when she was about to be particularly condescending. "Evelyn, just a friendly reminder about Leo's party today," she chirped. "It's at Wiggle Giggle Zone on the edge of town. 2 o'clock sharp. Please, try not to be late this time." The implication hung in the air, that I was doddering, unreliable, a problem to be managed. After I hung up, the name of the place echoed in my head. Wiggle Giggle Zone. It sounded like a migraine. I pictured a warehouse of flashing lights, screaming children, and sticky floors, a place so detached from the natural world I cherished. My idea of a party involved a backyard, a home-baked cake, and the sound of genuine laughter, not the pre-packaged, manufactured fun that Brenda seemed to favor. I felt a wave of exhaustion just thinking about it, the deep, bone-weary fatigue of someone who no longer recognizes the world she lives in. I focused instead on the one thing that made sense: Leo's gift. I had spent weeks searching for it, finally finding a beautiful, leather-bound edition of Swiss folk tales, the very stories my own grandmother used to read to me. I wrapped it myself in thick gold paper and tied it with a perfect satin ribbon. This was my language. Since I couldn't seem to find the right words to connect with my son anymore, perhaps I could still connect with my grandson through the quiet, timeless magic of a story. It felt like the only piece of myself I could still offer. As I was wrapping the gift, my thoughts drifted to Mark, my dear Mark, my late daughter Sarah's husband. He was the opposite of Brenda in every way. He called every Sunday just to check in. He'd ask about my peonies, about my latest batch of Kringles, and he'd listen, truly listen, to my answers. He never made me feel like a burden. He was the last living piece of my Sarah, and his kindness was a balm on the raw, unhealing wound of her absence. Sometimes I felt he was more my son than Rick was. Thinking of Sarah brought the familiar pang of grief, sharp and sudden as it always was. It's been 12 years, but some days it feels like yesterday. I saw her face in Leo's smile, heard her laugh in the rustle of the leaves outside my window. Mark was the keeper of her memory alongside me, and our shared loss forged a bond that Brenda's modern sensibilities could never comprehend or penetrate. I knew Mark would be at the party, and the thought of seeing his warm, familiar face was the one thing that gave me a sliver of courage. Defiantly, I decided to bake a small batch of Leo's favorite cherry brandy chocolates. Brenda had explicitly told me not to bring a thing. "It's all catered, Evelyn. We don't need anything." But the act of melting the chocolate, of dipping each cherry with the steady hand I'd honed over 50 years, was an act of rebellion. It was me refusing to be erased. These chocolates were a part of my identity, a part of our family's history, and I wouldn't let her cater that away. They were a message to my grandson. Grandma is still here. As the chocolates cooled on their wax paper, that strange smell returned, stronger this time. I followed my nose down the hall to Arthur's old study, a room I mostly kept closed now. The odor was definitely coming from in there. It was a musty, almost chemical sweetness, like old paper and something else I couldn't identify. I opened the door, but the room looked exactly as it always had. I made a mental note to air it out later, blaming the summer humidity and the old bones of the house. I couldn't have known. The smell was a secret, waiting. I glanced at the cuckoo clock on the wall. It was already past noon. Time was slipping away, and I had to start getting ready for the party. A heavy dread settled over me as I walked to my bedroom. It wasn't just the noise or the crowds I feared. It was the feeling of being an exhibit from a natural history museum, a relic of a bygone era, put on display for my daughter-in-law and her modern friends to observe with polite, detached curiosity. I felt like I had to put on a costume to attend my own grandson's party. As I put on my good lavender dress, the one Arthur always said brought out the color of my eyes, I caught my reflection in the full-length mirror on the closet door. The woman staring back at me looked tired. The lines around my eyes and mouth seemed deeper today, carved by years of laughter, yes, but also by grief and a growing sense of isolation. For the first time, a sliver of doubt crept in, cold and sharp. What if Brenda was right? What if I was just an old woman in a lavender dress, clinging to a world that no longer had a place for me? The drive to the party venue was quiet. I watched the familiar sights of New Glarus pass by my window, the charming storefronts, the flower boxes overflowing with geraniums, but I saw none of it. My mind was a loop of anxieties. Would I know anyone there? What would I talk about? How long would I have to stay before I could politely excuse myself and retreat back to the safety of my quiet, cinnamon-scented home? Each red light felt like a temporary reprieve, a few more seconds of peace before I had to face the music, both literally and figuratively. It's a strange thing, aging. It's not just the physical aches and the slowing down. It's the growing realization that the world is no longer built for you. The music is too loud, the conversations too fast, the technology too complex. You start to feel like a visitor from another country, one who doesn't speak the language or understand the customs. There is a deep, profound loneliness in that feeling, a silent struggle that you can't quite explain to those who are still racing ahead at full speed. I thought about the parties we used to host in this very house. The backyard would be full of family and friends. The air would smell of grilled hot dogs and freshly cut grass. Arthur would be at the center of it all, his booming laugh the soundtrack to our lives. Children would run around until their knees were grass-stained, and the adults would linger on the porch long after the sun went down. It was a simple, unpretentious joy. The thought of the wiggle-giggle zone felt like a betrayal of those memories. Pulling into the massive parking lot, my heart sank. The building was a monstrosity of purple and green plastic, a monument to sensory overload. Even from the car, I could hear the thumping bass of the music inside. My hands, spotted with age, tightened on the steering wheel. For a moment, I considered just turning around and going home. Who would even notice if I wasn't there? But then I thought of Leo. I thought of the book and its golden paper and the small box of chocolates on the passenger seat. I couldn't let him down. Taking a slow, steadying breath, I gathered my things. Clutching the gift to my chest like a shield, I stepped out of the car. Each step toward the entrance felt like walking against a strong current. The automatic doors slid open with a synthetic whoosh, releasing a blast of frigid, recycled air and the full, overwhelming cacophony of the party. It was a wall of sound, electronic music, the dinging and whirring of arcade games, and the high-pitched shrieks of dozens of overstimulated children. It was even worse than I had imagined. My eyes scanned the chaotic scene, searching for a familiar face. I spotted Brenda almost immediately. She was standing with a group of other mothers, all of them dressed in trendy athletic wear, holding oversized tumblers. She was laughing, a bright artificial sound. Her eyes met mine across the room, and for a split second, I saw a flicker of undisguised annoyance before she pasted on a wide, welcoming smile and waved me over. It was a performance, and I was the inconvenient, unscripted character who had just walked on stage. Rick detached himself from a group of fathers huddled near a prize counter and came over to greet me. He gave me a quick, distracted hug that smelled of expensive cologne and a deep, unspoken guilt. "Mom, glad you could make it," he said, his eyes already darting back to his conversation. He didn't ask how I was, didn't comment on my dress, didn't even look me properly in the eye. In that moment, I didn't feel like his mother. I felt like a piece of furniture that had been delivered to the wrong address. An awkward antique chair cluttering up a sleek, modern room. Mark was the next person I saw, and his face was a welcome relief. He came over and gave me a genuine hug, the kind that feels warm and real. "Evelyn, you look lovely," he said, his voice a calm island in the ocean of noise. He took the small box of chocolates from my hands. "Are these what I think they are? Leo will be thrilled." His kindness was so simple, yet it felt like a lifeline. But even his presence couldn't completely dispel the crushing weight of my alienation. He was one person, and this was Brenda's world. I stood there on the edge of the chaos, a ghost at the feast, feeling utterly and completely alone. The beautifully wrapped gift suddenly felt heavy and foolish in my hands. The chocolates a pathetic, unwanted offering. The noise was a physical pressure, pressing in on me from all sides, making it hard to breathe. I scanned the swirling mass of running children, desperately searching for Leo's face, for my one anchor in this overwhelming sea of plastic and neon. I was trapped, encurralado, with no clear path forward except to stand there and endure the next 2 hours in a silence that no one else could hear. I finally spotted him, a small figure in a bright red t-shirt, his face illuminated by the pulsing blue light of a racing game. Leo. My heart ached with a sudden, fierce love. He was so engrossed, his small hands expertly maneuvering the plastic steering wheel, his tongue sticking out in concentration. For a moment, watching him, the overwhelming noise of the arcade faded into a gentle hum. He was a perfect blend of my Rick and my Sarah, a living, breathing piece of my past, and my only bridge to the future. I walked towards him, the heavy gift bag feeling a little lighter with each step. He saw me, and his face split into a wide, gap-toothed grin that was pure sunshine. "Grandma!" he shouted over the din of a nearby air hockey table. He abandoned his game mid-race and ran to me, wrapping his arms tightly around my waist. The simple, unquestioning affection in that hug was like a drink of cool water on a scorching day. I held him close, breathing in the scent of sugar and sweat that clung to him, the universal perfume of a happy child. This was why I was here. This one perfect moment. I knelt down, my old knees protesting so I could be at his level. "Happy birthday, my sweet boy," I said, my voice thick with emotion. I handed him the heavy, gold-wrapped book. His eyes widened as he took it, running his fingers over the satin ribbon. Behind him, I saw Rick give me a small, approving nod, but Brenda was approaching with Mark in tow, her smile as bright and hard as the fluorescent lights above. She positioned herself right beside Leo, a silent, proprietary claim. I leaned in to give Leo a kiss on his cheek, my lips brushing against his soft, warm skin. It was in that precise, suspended moment of tenderness that I heard it. A whisper, sharp and venomous, not meant for my ears, but impossible to miss. It was Brenda's voice, directed at Mark, who stood just behind her. "She smells like urine." The words sliced through the air, through the noise, through everything, and found their mark deep inside my chest. The world didn't just stop, it shattered into a million silent, glittering pieces. The sounds of the arcade rushed back in, but they were distorted, warped, like hearing them from underwater. The flashing lights blurred into a nauseating smear of color. I was still kneeling, my hand on Leo's shoulder, but I felt a million miles away. The 4 words echoed in the sudden, cavernous silence of my mind. "She smells like urine." It was an attack on my home, my kitchen, my body, my entire existence. It was a lie designed to annihilate the one thing I had left, my dignity. I watched, as if in slow motion, as Mark's face tightened. A flash of pure, unadulterated fury crossed his features, so quick I might have imagined it. He didn't look at me. He grabbed Brenda's arm, his fingers digging into her skin, and his voice was a low, dangerous hiss I could barely hear. "Shut up. Not now." He pulled her away. Subtle but forceful movement, steering her towards the other parents. His reaction was a confusing jumble of defense and evasion, a shield that protected me from her, but also from him. Leo, oblivious, was tearing at the wrapping paper. "Wow, Grandma, it's beautiful," he exclaimed, holding up the leather-bound book. I tried to form a smile, to say something, but my throat had closed up. All I could manage was a weak, trembling nod. The joy had been stolen from the moment, replaced by a cold, creeping shame that felt oily and unclean. I felt every eye in the room on me, even though I knew no one else had heard. The poison was inside me now, doing its work. I pushed myself to my feet, my joints screaming in protest. The room felt like it was tilting, the floor unsteady beneath my shoes. I had to get out of there. I muttered something about needing a glass of water, an excuse that sounded flimsy even to my own ears. I managed a smile for Leo, a fragile, cracked thing, but inside, I knew that sound, Brenda's whisper, would be the only thing I'd hear for the rest of the night. It had become the new soundtrack of my life. I stumbled toward the exit, moving through the crowd of laughing children and chattering parents like a ghost. No one noticed me. No one saw the silent devastation that had just occurred. To them, I was just a quiet old woman in a lavender dress, a harmless piece of the scenery. The cold blast of the air conditioner felt good against my suddenly feverish skin. I just needed to get to my car, to the familiar safe cocoon of my old Buick, where I could finally let the tears fall. The drive home was a blur. The familiar streets of New Glarus, usually a source of comfort, looked alien and hostile. Silent tears streamed down my cheeks, hot and angry. I didn't sob. It was a quiet, relentless weeping for a wound so deep I didn't know how it could ever heal. Why? The question hammered at my brain. Why would she hate me so much? What had I ever done to deserve such a public, degrading lie? A lie spoken at the one moment that should have been pure and full of love. My mind replayed Mark's reaction over and over again. "Shut up! Not now!" Was he defending me? Or was he just managing the situation? Was his anger directed at her cruelty or at her carelessness for being overheard? The ambiguity of it was a special kind of torture. He had silenced her, yes, but he hadn't refuted her. He hadn't turned to me with a kind word or a reassuring look. He had simply removed the problem, making him complicit in the cruelty, a silent partner in my humiliation. I thought of my son, Rick, across the room, oblivious. Would he have defended me? Or would he have stood there awkwardly, caught between his mother and his wife, paralyzed by a desire to keep the peace at all costs? The sad, honest answer was that I didn't know. And not knowing felt like its own kind of betrayal. I had become a footnote in my own son's life, an inconvenient truth he preferred to delegate to his wife to handle, no matter how cruelly. The shame was a physical thing, a lead weight in my gut. I felt dirty, contaminated by her words. I could almost smell it myself, the phantom scent of her lie. Would Leo believe it? Had that seed of contempt been planted in his young mind? The thought that my own grandson might one day look at me with pity or disgust was more than I could bear. She hadn't just insulted me. She had tried to poison my most precious relationship. I pulled into my driveway, the house looking exactly as I had left it, a peaceful, charming chalet surrounded by blooming peonies. But it no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a crime scene. Her words had followed me home, seeping into the very walls, tainting the scent of cinnamon and almond that I had always cherished. I sat in the car for a long time, the engine off, the silence of the garage amplifying the echo of her whisper in my head. Finally, I forced myself out of the car and into the house. The familiar warmth of my home did nothing to soothe the chill in my bones. I walked through the living room, my hand trailing over the polished wood of Arthur's favorite armchair. This house was a testament to a life of care, of cleanliness, of order. How could she say such a thing? The injustice of it was a fresh wave of grief. I knew then that I could never go back to the way things were, to the polite, strained dance of tolerance we had been performing for years. I walked down the hallway, my steps heavy, and that was when it hit me. The smell, the strange, cloying, chemical sweetness from Arthur's study. It was stronger than ever, a tangible presence in the air. For weeks, I had dismissed it as old age, as humidity, as nothing. But now, in the shadow of Brenda's accusation, it felt like something else entirely. It felt like an answer. My pain began to curdle, to harden into something cold and sharp. A quiet, unwavering resolve. Brenda had thrown her filth at me, trying to define me by a smell that wasn't there. But there was a smell in this house. A real one. A secret one. And it had nothing to do with me. It had to do with Arthur. A memory surfaced, hazy at first, then sharpening into focus. Arthur, in his last few months, spending hours locked in that study, the faint scent of chemicals clinging to his clothes when he emerged. He had been working on something he never told me about. A new kind of energy, cold and clear, began to flow through me, displacing the hot shame. What if this smell wasn't a sign of decay, but a clue? What if Arthur, my meticulous, careful Arthur, had left something behind? A final piece of our life together that I had yet to uncover. The thought was a small, steady light in the overwhelming darkness of my despair. It was a mission, a purpose. It was a way to fight back. I walked to the study door, my hand hovering over the cold brass knob. For years, I had kept this room as a shrine, a perfectly preserved monument to the man I loved. I rarely entered, afraid to disturb the dust, afraid to disturb the memories. But Brenda's cruelty had changed that. It had desecrated my memories far more than opening a door ever could. She had tried to bury me in shame, but instead, she had given me a shovel. My heart was pounding, not with fear, but with a strange, fierce anticipation. The doubt and the tears were gone, replaced by a crystalline clarity. This was no longer just about a cruel remark at a birthday party. This was about my life, my home, my husband's legacy. This was about truth, and I was the only one left to find it. The key wasn't just to prove Brenda wrong, but to uncover a truth she couldn't possibly comprehend. I thought about Mark again. His reaction, which had seemed so ambiguous before, now looked different. Perhaps his fury wasn't just about her lack of tact. Perhaps he knew something. He had worked with Arthur in his accounting firm for years. He knew my husband's habits, his secrets, better than anyone, even Rick. That thought settled in my mind. A hard, cold fact. Mark was a piece of this puzzle, whether he wanted to be or not. The house was silent except for the steady ticking of the cuckoo clock in the living room, counting down the seconds to a revelation I could feel in my bones. Brenda thought she had won. She thought her words had the power to reduce me to a pathetic old woman, to erase me from my own family. She had no idea what she had just unleashed. She had poked the quiet, sleeping bear of my grief and my dignity. And it was finally waking up. I took a deep, steadying breath, the strange, sweet smell filling my lungs. It no longer smelled like decay. It smelled like a beginning. It smelled like justice. My hand closed around the doorknob, the metal cool and solid against my skin. I was no longer the victim of Brenda's petty cruelty. I was the keeper of Arthur's last secret, and I was about to unlock the door. My resolve was absolute. I would find out what was in that room. I would understand the source of that smell, and I would uncover the truth my husband had hidden away. Brenda wanted to talk about smells, about things being unclean. Fine, we would talk about it. But when the truth finally came out, it wouldn't be me who was left covered in filth. Her lie was not the end of my story. It was the beginning of hers. I turned the cold brass doorknob and pushed the door to Arthur's study open. The air that rolled out was thick and heavy, carrying that sweet, chemical scent so intensely it made my eyes water. For a moment, I just stood there on the threshold, letting the dust motes dance in the sliver of light from the hallway. The room was a time capsule, exactly as he had left it. His leather-bound ledgers stacked neatly on the corner of the desk, his favorite fountain pen resting in its ceramic holder, a fine layer of dust coating everything like a respectful shroud. My first instinct was to close the door again, to preserve the sanctity of the space. But Brenda's whisper echoed in my ears, a desecration that had already occurred. I had to move forward. My search began clumsily, a frantic, unfocused rummaging born of pain and anger. I pulled open the desk drawers, my fingers fumbling through old paper clips, dried-up ink bottles, and stacks of yellowed stationery. I ran my hands under the desk, along the shelves, searching for a loose board or a hidden compartment like in the mystery novels I sometimes read. But Arthur was a man of logic, not theatrics. There was nothing. A wave of despair washed over me. What if I was wrong? What if it really was just the smell of an old house, and I was just a foolish old woman chasing shadows, driven mad by a cruel insult? The thought almost made me stop. I sat down heavily in his worn leather chair, the cracked material groaning under my weight. Brenda's words came back, sharp and clear. She smells like urine. In that moment of doubt, her voice was the loudest thing in the room. I felt the familiar sting of tears behind my eyes, the helplessness returning. Was I losing my mind? Was this how it started? A phantom smell, a wild goose chase, a slow descent into the very caricature of an old woman that she had painted me as. The fear was a cold knot in my stomach, more paralyzing than the anger had been. But then, my eyes landed on the bookshelf. It was filled with volumes on accounting, tax law, and Wisconsin history. Arthur's passions. He had always told me, "Everything has a system, Evelyn. You just have to find the pattern." It was how he ran his business, how he planned our garden, how he lived his life. My baking was the same. A recipe wasn't a suggestion. It was a formula that required precision and order. I took a deep breath, pushing the shame and fear aside. I would not search like a panicked animal. I would search like Arthur. I would be methodical. I started with the bookshelf, pulling down each heavy tome, one by one. I fanned the pages, checking for anything tucked inside, tapping the bindings, feeling for any hollowed-out spaces. It was tedious, dusty work that made my shoulders ache. An hour passed, then 2. The cuckoo clock chirped its lonely song down the hall. Just as I was about to give up on the books, something slipped from a thick volume on state tax codes. It wasn't a letter or a key. It was a receipt, folded into a tiny square, from a chemical supply store over in Madison, dated just 3 months before. Arthur passed. The purchase was for 5 pounds of something called sodium thiosulfate. I had no idea what it was, but it was a clue. It was real. The receipt became my compass. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in nearly a decade. I went to the New Glarus Public Library. The young librarian, a kind girl with bright pink hair, showed me how to use the public computers. My fingers felt clumsy and oversized on the keyboard, and my eyes struggled to read the glowing screen. I felt a flash of the same alienation I'd experienced at the party, a sense that the world had moved on without me. But the name on the receipt, sodium thiosulfate, pushed me forward. I painstakingly typed it into the search bar, my heart pounding with a strange mix of fear and excitement. The results were confusing at first. The chemical was used in photography to fix the developing process. It was also used in water treatment and, in some cases, as an antidote to certain types of poisoning. Arthur wasn't a photographer, and our water was just fine. The word poison sent a chill down my spine, but it didn't feel right. He wasn't the kind of man to be involved in something so sordid, but the photography angle stuck with me. It was a tangible field, a process, a system. There had to be a connection I was missing. My daily routine began to change. I still tended my peonies, but my mind was elsewhere, sifting through memories of Arthur's last months. I still baked my kringles, the familiar. Motions of kneading dough and measuring sugar, a comforting rhythm against the chaos of my thoughts. But now, the kitchen was my war room. As I dipped each cherry in chocolate, I wasn't just making candy. I was formulating a plan, running through possibilities. The baking, once a source of simple joy, had become my meditation, the one place where I could think clearly, away from the dust and the overwhelming smell of the study. The phone rang one afternoon, and it was Rick. His voice was laced with a strained, manufactured concern. "Mom, Brenda told me you left Leo's party without saying goodbye. Are you feeling all right?" I could hear Brenda whispering in the background, coaching him. The old me would have apologized, made an excuse, tried to smooth things over. But the woman who had spent hours researching chemical compounds was different. "I was tired, Rick," I said, my voice cool and even. That place was very loud. I didn't offer more. The silence that followed was full of his discomfort, and for the first time, I felt a sliver of power in it. Armed with the new possibility of photography, I returned to the study with a renewed sense of purpose. I ignored the books and the desk this time, focusing instead on the large closet in the corner, a space I hadn't opened in years. It was filled with old tax records in cardboard boxes and Arthur's winter coats, which still smelled faintly of him. But tucked away in the very back, under a pile of moth-eaten wool blankets, was something else. A heavy, dark green metal footlocker. It was cold to the touch and sealed with a combination lock. My breath caught in my throat. This was it. My first thought was to call Mark. He was good with things like this. He would have it open in minutes. But then the scene at the party replayed in my mind. His furious, whispered command to Brenda, his careful avoidance of my eyes. He had protected me from a scene, not from the wound. He had managed the situation. And if he was managing things then, what might he be managing now? The sudden, cold suspicion was a new and unwelcome feeling. It isolated me further, but it also hardened my resolve. I had to do this alone. I couldn't trust anyone. I found Arthur's old toolbox in the garage and brought it to the study. My first attempts to open the lock were pathetic. I hammered at it, trying to break the shackle, but the blows just echoed uselessly in the quiet room. I tried to pry it open with a screwdriver, but only managed to scratch the metal and pinch my finger, a sharp, blooming pain that brought tears to my eyes. I sank back on my heels, defeated, the smell of dust and failure filling my nostrils. The voice of doubt returned, whispering that I was just a weak old woman, playing a game I couldn't win. As if summoned by my despair, Mark appeared at my door the next day, holding a small bouquet of peonies from his own garden, a mirror of mine. "Evelyn," he said, his expression a careful mixture of concern and, apology. I wanted to say how sorry I am for Brenda's behavior. It was completely unacceptable. He stepped inside, and his eyes immediately fell on the footlocker I'd dragged into the living room. "Doing some spring cleaning?" he asked, his tone casual, but his eyes were sharp, analytical. A lie formed on my lips before I even thought about it. Yes, just getting rid of some of Arthur's old things. The ease with which I said it both scared and empowered me. His visit changed everything. His apology felt hollow, rehearsed. He was watching me, I realized, trying to gauge what I was thinking, what I knew. He wasn't here as my grieving son-in-law. He was here on a reconnaissance mission. The moment he left, the fear was gone, replaced by a cold, clarifying anger. He was part of this. I didn't know how, but I felt it in my bones. I went back to the lock, no longer frantic. I sat on the floor, my old joints protesting, and looked at the combination dial. I thought about Arthur, about the numbers that mattered to him. I tried our anniversary. Nothing. His birthday? Nothing. Then, with a trembling hand, I dialed the combination for Sarah's birthday. The lock clicked open with a sound that was as loud as a gunshot in the silent house. I lifted the heavy lid. The chemical smell exploded from the box, acrid and overwhelming. My heart hammered against my ribs. But inside, there were no photographs, no sentimental keepsakes. It was filled to the brim with paper, stacks of documents, held together with rubber bands, bank ledgers from a Swiss account I never knew existed, legal correspondence with a law firm in Zurich, and a thick file containing dozens of chemically treated receipts and invoices, the source of the smell. Arthur hadn't been a secret photographer. He had been a secret archivist, using a chemical process to preserve fragile, ink-faded evidence. For the next 3 days, I barely slept. I spread the documents across my dining room table, the scent of cinnamon from my kitchen mingling with the strange, sharp odor of my husband's secret. I sat with a dictionary and a magnifying glass, painstakingly piecing together a story of devastating betrayal. Arthur's longtime business partner, a man I had welcomed into my home for dinner countless times, had systematically embezzled millions from their clients, funneling the money into offshore accounts and creating a false paper trail to implicate Arthur. My husband had discovered the fraud in his final year and had been quietly building a case to expose him, to clear his name and return the stolen money. He died before he could finish. The name of the partner, Franklin Miller, stared up at me from the page. I knew his son, a slick real estate developer, who was now a prominent figure in the community. He was one of Rick and Brenda's friends. They had all been at the party. Suddenly, so many things made sense. The strained silences, the carefully managed conversations, Brenda's desperate need to paint me as incompetent, senile, and irrelevant. It wasn't just about me being old-fashioned. It was about me being a loose end, a potential threat to their carefully constructed world. The shame Brenda had inflicted on me at the party seemed like a distant memory, a child's insult in the face of this colossal adult treachery. My grief for Arthur shifted, transforming from a soft, aching sadness into a sharp, protective rage. He had died carrying this immense burden alone, trying to protect his family, his honor. They had let me believe he had left his firm in a mess, that his last years were marked by confusion. They had lied about him, and now Brenda was lying about me. The parallel was so stark, so brutal, it took my breath away. My fight was no longer just for my own dignity, it was for his. The phone rang again, pulling me from my thoughts. It was Brenda. Her voice was no longer sweet or condescending. It was crisp, businesslike. "Evelyn," she began, without any preamble. "Rick and I have been talking, and we think it's time to discuss your living situation. That house is far too big for you to manage alone. We found a lovely assisted living community just outside of town that we'd like you to visit." The attack was no longer a whisper. It was a full frontal assault. A clear move to get me out of this house, away from Arthur's secrets. I looked at the papers spread across my table, the proof of my husband's integrity and my own purpose. The old Evelyn, the quiet woman, who baked kringles and tended her peonies, would have been terrified. She would have stammered, cried, or simply acquiesced, worn down by the sheer force of their will. But I was not that woman anymore. The past week had forged me into someone new, someone harder, someone who understood the value of a well-kept secret and the power of a well-timed revelation. A strange calm settled over me. I held the phone to my ear, the evidence of their world's undoing laid out before me. "Thank you for your concern, Brenda," I said, and my voice was as steady and cold as the Wisconsin winter. "But I won't be going anywhere. In fact, I have some business to attend to. Business that Arthur left unfinished." I paused, letting the weight of my words hang in the air between us. "I'll be in touch." Then, before she could utter a single word, I hung up the phone. I stood there in the silence of my kitchen, the cuckoo clock on the wall ticking away the seconds. The house no longer felt like a lonely sanctuary. It felt like headquarters. The woman who had fled a child's birthday party in tears of shame was gone forever. In her place stood a woman who held the truth in her hands, a truth that smelled of chemicals and cinnamon, of betrayal and justice. My husband had started this fight, and he had left me the map and the ammunition. I caught my reflection in the dark glass of the oven door. The woman staring back at me looked her age. Yes, the lines of 78 years etched into her face. But her eyes were different. They were not the soft, weary eyes of a grandmother. They were the sharp, focused eyes of a woman who had a score to settle. Brenda thought she could erase me with a whisper. She had no idea that she had just handed me a megaphone. I was no longer just a relic. I was a reckoning. And I was just getting started. The next morning, the sun streamed into my kitchen. But for the first time in my life, I didn't reach for the flour and sugar. The documents lay spread across my dining table like a battle map, and I knew my first move couldn't be made with a whisk. I found a number in the phone book for a lawyer in downtown Madison, a man named Mr. Gable, who had a reputation for being thorough and unyieldingly honest. My hand trembled as I dialed, the plastic of the old rotary phone cool against my skin, but my voice, when I spoke, was a stranger to me. It was calm, measured, and completely devoid of the fear that had been my constant companion. I drove myself to his office that afternoon, the box of Arthur's documents resting on the passenger seat like a sacred text. The office smelled of old leather and floor wax, a scent of quiet, established power. Mr. Gable was a man in his 60s with kind eyes but a sharp, analytical gaze. He listened patiently as I laid out my story, starting with the smell in the study and ending with the papers before him. I saw the initial skepticism in his face, the polite patience one affords an elderly woman with a confusing story. But as I pushed the first of the Swiss bank ledgers across his polished desk, his expression shifted entirely. He spent nearly an hour in silence, his brow furrowed in concentration as he examined the chemically treated receipts with a gloved hand. The only sound in the room was the soft rustle of paper and the distant tick of a grandfather clock in the hall. Finally, he looked up at me, his eyes no longer kind but filled with a fierce, protective respect. "Mrs. Peterson," he said, his voice low and serious, "your husband was a brilliant, meticulous man, and a very brave one. This is one of the most comprehensive private cases of fraud I have ever seen. We have everything we need." Leaving his office, I felt lighter than I had in 20 years. The shame Brenda had tried to cloak me in had been burned away by the clean, bright fire of truth. I wasn't a confused old woman. I was the custodian of my husband's legacy. But there was one loose thread that still bothered me. Mark. That evening I called him. I didn't accuse him. I simply said, "Mark, I need to talk to you about Arthur. Can you come over tomorrow morning?" His silence on the other end of the line was heavy with a guilt I could now clearly identify. He agreed to come. He sat in Arthur's armchair in my living room, refusing the coffee I offered. I didn't show him the papers. I just looked at him, my gaze steady, and said, "You knew something was wrong, didn't you? All those years ago." He finally broke, the carefully constructed composure crumbling away. He confessed that near the end, Arthur had confided in him that there were discrepancies at the firm, that he was worried about Franklin Miller. Arthur had made him promise not to say a word until he had all the proof, for fear Miller would destroy it. Mark's sin wasn't malice, it was cowardice, a fear that had kept him silent for 2 decades. His confession was a painful but necessary cleansing. He had been so paralyzed by his promise to Arthur, and his fear of the powerful Miller family that he had allowed Brenda's narrative about my supposed decline to take root, perhaps as a way to justify his own inaction. "I am so sorry, Evelyn," he whispered, his face in his hands. "I should have been stronger." I didn't offer him forgiveness, not yet. I simply nodded and said, "The truth is coming out now, Mark. You can either stand with it or be buried by it." It was the hardest thing I had ever said, but it was also the most honest. The first lawyer's letters were sent out the following week. The explosion was immediate and catastrophic. Rick called me, his voice a frantic, panicked torrent of words. "Mom, what have you done? The Millers are our friends. Brenda is beside herself. You're going to ruin us." He wasn't asking if I was okay. He wasn't asking what the truth was. He was only concerned with the social fallout, with the collapse of the comfortable, dishonest world he and his wife had built. The son I had raised was gone, replaced by this stranger who valued appearances above his own mother's honor. "I am not the one who did the ruining, Rick," I replied, my voice as cold and clear as a frozen lake. "I am simply cleaning up a mess that has been festering for 20 years. A mess your father died trying to expose." I told him about the evidence, about the stolen money, about the lies that had been told about his own father. I laid the truth out for him, a stark and ugly thing, and then I left him to sit with it in silence. For the first time, he had no words, no coaching from Brenda in the background. There was only the sound of his own hollow breathing. News of the investigation spread through New Glarus like wildfire. When I went to the market, people looked at me differently. The polite, sometimes condescending smiles were gone, replaced by looks of awe and a newfound respect. Mrs. Glarner, the town's biggest gossip, stopped me by the cheese aisle, not to pry, but to touch my arm gently. "Evelyn," she said, her voice uncharacteristically soft, "Arthur would be so proud of you." I realized then that my victory wasn't just about the money or the law. It was about reclaiming my name, my story, in the town that had been my entire world. I started baking again, not out of habit, but out of joy. The familiar scent of cinnamon and almond filling my home no longer felt like a defense against loneliness. It felt like a celebration of my own resilience. The kitchen was my sanctuary once more, but now it was also my fortress. I was no longer the quiet, unassuming widow. I was Evelyn Peterson, the woman who had unearthed a 20-year-old crime, the woman who had stood up to the town's most powerful family. I had found a strength I never knew I possessed. The legal battle was swift. Faced with Arthur's irrefutable evidence, the Miller family crumbled. Their assets were frozen, and Franklin's son, the slick developer, was implicated in helping hide the money for years. The story was in the eye. Madison Papers. Arthur's name was not just cleared, it was heralded. He was posthumously honored by the state accounting board for his integrity. I sat in my quiet living room, reading the article, and wept. They were not tears of sadness or anger, but tears of profound, bone-deep relief. The fight was over. Arthur could finally rest. A few weeks later, A car pulled into my driveway. It was Rick and Brenda. They stood on my doorstep, looking smaller, diminished. Brenda's face was pale, stripped of its usual confident smirk. Rick looked older, the weight of his choices etched around his eyes. I let them in and served them tea in the good china, the silence stretching between us. They had not come to apologize for the whisper at the party. They had come because their social standing was in ruins, and they had nowhere else to go. Brenda was the first to speak, her voice a strained whisper that was a pathetic echo of the one that had started it all. "Evelyn, we're sorry. We didn't know." The lie was so blatant, so self-serving, it was almost laughable. She was sorry she got caught, not for the cruelty she had inflicted. I looked at her, at the woman who had tried to define me by a smell, who had tried to strip me of my home and my sanity, and I felt nothing but a distant, cold pity. She was the one who was truly unclean. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't list their sins. I simply looked at my son and said, "The door to this house will always be open to my grandson. Leo is welcome here any time. But you and I, Rick, we have nothing more to say to each other for a very long time." I then turned to Brenda. "You tried to bury me," I said, my voice quiet but unshakable. "You didn't realize that I was a seed." I stood up, went to the door and held it open. They walked out of my house and out of my life, without another word. After they left, I walked out into my garden. The peonies were in full bloom, their heavy pink heads nodding in the late afternoon sun. I knelt down, my knees barely protesting anymore, and touched one of the soft, ruffled petals. The world felt quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet. It wasn't the silence of loneliness. It was the silence of peace. I had faced the ugliest parts of my life, the grief, the disrespect, the betrayal, and I had not only survived, I had won. The house behind me felt different too. It was no longer a museum of the past, but a testament to the future. My future. Arthur's secret had been a burden he carried, but for me, it had been a key. It unlocked a part of myself I thought had died with him. My fight, my voice, my power. I was 78 years old, and I felt as though my life had just truly begun. The old Evelyn would have been crushed by Brenda's words, but the woman I was now understood their true meaning. They were a gift. I spent the evening writing a letter to Leo, telling him the story of his grandfather's courage and integrity. I tucked it inside the cover of the Swiss folk tale book I had given him, a story of a different kind of hero for him to read when he was older. I wanted him to know that strength isn't about being the loudest person in the room. Sometimes it's about being the quietest, the one who watches, who listens, and who knows the value of the truth. My victory was not just in the courtroom or in the newspaper headlines. It was in the small, tangible moments. It was Mark, stopping by with his tools to fix the loose step on my porch without being asked. It was receiving an order for a dozen Kringles for a wedding from a family I didn't even know. It was the simple, profound freedom of waking up in my own home, knowing that I was the sole author of my days. The contrast between the woman who fled that noisy party in tears and the woman I am today is staggering. Before, I was defined by my roles: wife, mother, grandmother. I moved through the world quietly, trying not to be a bother. Now, I am defined by my own name, Evelyn Peterson. I learned that dignity is not something others can give you or take away. It is the foundation you build for yourself, brick by brick, truth by truth. My reflection in the mirror no longer looks tired. The lines on my face are the same, but my eyes are different. They hold the quiet confidence of someone who has been tested by fire and emerged not scorched, but forged. I am a living testament to the fact that it is never too late to demand respect, to fight for what is right, and to rewrite the ending of your own story. My home still smells of cinnamon, but now it also smells of victory. I look back at that horrible moment at the party, at that cruel, poisonous whisper. It was designed to be an ending, to label me and put me away on a shelf to gather dust. But it wasn't an ending. It was an awakening. It was the crack of a whip that spurred an old, tired horse into a full gallop. Brenda's lie was the ugliest thing I had ever heard, but it led me to the most beautiful thing I have ever known: my own strength. The world is full of whispers, little poisons meant to make us feel small, old, or irrelevant. People will try to define you, to put you in a box that makes them feel comfortable. They will judge your home, your clothes, your age, your very essence. They will try to tell you who you are. Do not let them. You are the only one who holds that power. I am 78 years old, and I am here to tell you that your voice matters, whether you are 18 or 80. Do not let anyone silence you. Do not let anyone make you feel ashamed of the life you have lived. Sometimes the greatest battles are fought in the quietest of places, in a dusty old study, in a lawyer's office, or in the steady gaze you give to someone who has wronged you. My husband left me a secret that saved my dignity, but the truth is, that power was inside me all along. It's inside you too. Find it. Use it. Let your truth be the scent that you leave behind in this world, a scent of integrity, of courage, of a life lived with unwavering honor. And let it be so strong that no lie can ever overpower it.